Imagine this. You peek into your neighbor's window and see him dancing with a creepy, life-sized doll. And then, to your absolute horror, you find out that this doll is actually the corpse of a young woman he's been sleeping next to for the past 7 years. We are opening the craziest folder in the archive. A love story that turned out to be more terrifying than death itself. You are watching Raccoon Archives, and today we are taking a glimpse into pure hell. Let's go. The year is 1930, Key West, Florida. A place where the damp, sticky ocean air is thoroughly soaked with the stench of rotting seaweed, cheap tobacco, and the heavy despair of the Great Depression. Where the tropical heat drives people mad, and deadly diseases spread through the narrow streets faster than rumors. It is here, in the local naval hospital, that a profoundly strange man works. A 53-year-old radiologist who arrogantly demands that his colleagues and patients address him exclusively as Count von Cosel. The true name of this man is Georg Karl Tanzler, and he was a textbook, classic example of a pathological liar with a deeply rooted, grandiose delusion of grandeur. He fabricated an aristocratic noble title for himself, invented 9 prestigious university degrees that he never actually possessed, told casual acquaintances blatant tall tales about being a submarine captain during the war, and got a job as a radiologist in an American hospital simply because, in those years, X-ray machines seemed to ordinary people like some sort of incomprehensible magic. The hospital administration didn't bother too much with verifying the credentials of this foreign specialist, who knew how to push the buttons of this deadly yet fully misunderstood machine. From his very early childhood, his mind was irrevocably poisoned by auditory and visual hallucinations, which he explained to himself as visits from the spirits of deceased ancestors, specifically a certain Countess Anna Constantia von Cosel, who supposedly appeared to him regularly in his dreams and showed him the face of his true, one and only star-crossed love, a dark-haired, exotic beauty. In the language of modern, ruthless medicine, this is neither mysticism, a curse, nor a gift from above. It is a severe form of schizophrenia, multiplied by a blatant narcissistic personality disorder. It was the classic defense mechanism of a lonely, arrogant, and unsuccessful loser who invented an illusory, perfect world with titles and ghosts, simply because the real world did not recognize him and rejected him. And so, on one stifling April day in 1930, into his darkened hospital office, smelling of ozone, hot dust, and pungent film-developing chemicals, she walked with an uncertain step. Elena de Hoyos. She was only 21 years old. A local beauty from a very poor family of Cuban immigrants who made their living rolling cigars. Her young life had already been ruthlessly broken. A failed marriage to a man who cowardly fled and abandoned her right after a miscarriage, and now a terrifying, relentless diagnosis that sounded in the doctor's office like a deafening bell strike. Tuberculosis. In the 1930s, this disease was popularly known as the White Plague, or consumption, and it was an absolute 100% ticket to the grave, with no right to appeal. Effective antibiotics simply hadn't been discovered yet. No viable treatment existed in nature, and infected people just slowly, incredibly painfully suffocated over the course of many months, coughing up their own rotting lungs into blood-soaked handkerchiefs, losing weight until they resembled skeletons, and fading away in a relentless fever. For Dr. Tanzler, Elena's appearance under the rays of the X-ray machine was not just a routine encounter with another severely ill patient. It was a fatal click that forever short-circuited his sick, inflamed brain. He develops her X-ray, sees her face, and his paranoid delusion instantly, without the slightest hesitation, projects onto this frightened, dying girl that exact image from his years of hallucinations. He firmly and irrevocably convinces himself that he has found that very woman from his visions, his destined, perfect bride. Tanzler took advantage of this monstrous vulnerability of the grief-stricken family with the terrifying, cold-blooded calculation of a psychopath. He convinced Elena's uneducated parents that he possessed secret, advanced European medical knowledge inaccessible to local doctors. Illegally, risking prison, he would carry bulky, heavy X-ray equipment out of the naval hospital, haul it into the tiny wooden house of the Hoyos family, and methodically irradiate the defenseless girl with massive, uncontrolled doses of radiation. He sincerely, but absolutely mistakenly, believed that X-rays could scorch the coke bacillus right out of her deteriorating lungs. He set up a veritable alchemical laboratory in her bedroom, mixing poisonous, burning elixirs from bismuth salts, dissolved gold particles, toxic herbs, and chemical reagents in glass test tubes, forcing Elena to drink this dreadful poison. He wasn't treating her in the classical medical sense. He was conducting his cruel, insane experiment on her, trying to play God, yearning to become that almighty soul savior before whom she would fall to her knees in eternal gratitude after her recovery. Meanwhile, to solidify his control, he literally showered the destitute Cuban family with money. He bought Elena expensive silk dresses that she was physically too weak to wear, brought her gold jewelry, and even purchased a massive, luxurious bed for her, installing it in their dilapidated little house like a throne for a dying queen. The family reluctantly endured his obsessive daily visits and his creepy, inappropriate confessions of eternal love, because he was their sole sponsor and the illusory chance of saving their daughter. And Elena herself lived in a state of permanent fear. She didn't love this 53-year-old man with sunken cheeks and a mad, unblinking gaze for a single second. She was terrified of him to the point her knees trembled, but she dared not refuse or be rude. She smiled politely through excruciating physical pain and submissively accepted his gifts because she was backed into a corner. She understood perfectly well that if this insane but wealthy doctor left, she would be left all alone with her agonizing death, without a single chance of care, or even a sip of painkillers. Tanzler came every evening, sitting by her bed for long hours, absolutely ignoring the nauseating Swedish stench of rotting lung tissues and the sight of fresh blood on the snow-white pillows. He didn't care at all about the real girl with her human fears, pain, tears, and desires. He didn't love a living person. He loved the perfect concept in his own head, a submissive, helpless doll that he was obligated to fix. He was blindly convinced that his fabricated genius was capable of cheating death and canceling the unshakable laws of biology. But nature is ruthless and always takes its toll. Despite the daily radiation exposure, which only destroyed her residual immunity and literally burned her healthy tissues, and despite the toxic chemical cocktails that irreversibly poisoned her internal organs, tuberculosis mercilessly devoured Elena from the inside. She was fading right before their eyes, turning into a living, breathing skeleton. Her once beautiful olive skin became transparent like thin tissue paper, through which her blue veins frighteningly showed. Her eyes sank deep into her skull, turning into massive dark abysses full of suffering on her emaciated face, and every breath was accompanied by the horrifying wet wheeze of her tearing, fluid-filled lungs. In late October of 1931, after a year and a half of these pseudo-medical, elaborate tortures, her agony reached its final, unbearable peak. Tanzler was right beside her, tightly squeezing her weakening hand, covered in cold sweat. Right up to the very last second, he stubbornly believed that his twisted science would work, that he would snatch her from the cold clutches of death, and she would finally look at him with adoration. But no miracle occurred. Elena took a final convulsive gulp of the humid air. Her disease-ravaged chest fell, and she died, having never reciprocated his sick, suffocating passion. He stared at the lifeless, withered body of the 22-year-old girl, and his broken psyche, physically unable to accept such a grandiose personal defeat, instantly began to construct a new, even more terrifying and twisted reality. His psychological defense mechanism triggered flawlessly and monstrously. If he couldn't fully possess her in life, if her own free will, her relatives, and the invisible laws of society stood between them, now all those barriers had crumbled forever. In death, she belonged only to him. She could no longer say no. She could no longer turn away in undisguised disgust. She could no longer fearfully pull her hand away from his senile touch. Now she was perfect, absolutely submissive, silent property. It was precisely in this terrifying moment, in the stifling, dimly lit room of the Cuban house, thoroughly reeking of death, fear, and medicines, that radiologist Carl Tanzler completely ceased to exist as a doctor and as a human being. In his place emerged an absolutely insane creator necromancer, for whom the absence of his beloved's pulse and breath no longer mattered in the slightest. He turns to Elena's parents, sobbing by the bed, and maintaining a blood-curdling calmness, peremptorily insists on fully covering all the funeral and embalming expenses. The family, utterly devastated by grief, completely crushed by debt, and having lost the will to resist, agrees with sincere, tearful gratitude. They didn't suspect for a second in that cursed moment that they were signing an unspoken contract with a true monster, voluntarily handing over the body of their beloved daughter into the hands of a man whose mind had long since left the bounds of human morality and plunged into the blackest, impenetrable abyss of obsession. For him, the physical death of the girl was merely a starting point, the beginning of his monstrous multi-year experiment to create the perfect, eternal bride, one who would never leave him, never grow old, and never betray him, because the dead do not know how to betray. They only know how to wait silently in the darkness of the tomb until their mad creator comes for them, to take them from the grave into his personal, endless hell. The death of Elena de Hoyos in October 1931 became the final chord in a long, exhausting symphony of grief for her tormented, impoverished Cuban family. But for Dr. Carl Tanzler, this physical death was merely an annoying hiccup, a bureaucratic formality that didn't stop his maniacal obsession for a single second. As soon as the girl took her last breath, Tanzler, completely unbothered by the presence of her sobbing relatives, categorically and flat out refused to bury Elena in the ground. To his sick mind, the earth meant dampness, worms, uncontrollable decay, and most importantly, the absolute loss of access to the object of his passion. Therefore, He hired workers, and for a colossal sum of money for those times, ordered the construction of a real, monumental stone mausoleum at the Key West Cemetery, towering over the other graves like a monument to his madness. But in this grand gesture, there was one terrifying, strictly calculated detail. Tanzler ordered a secure internal lock to be installed on the heavy iron doors of the crypt, and he put the only key to this tomb existing in nature into his pocket, depriving even her own parents of the ability to freely visit their deceased daughter. From that moment on, the mausoleum turned into his personal, inviolable territory, into his secret temple of necromancy, where he came absolutely every single night for a long, agonizing year and a half. Imagine this picture: a thick, sticky Florida night, the piercing chirp of cicadas, damp fog rolling between the stone crosses, and an older, skinny man sneaking up to the crypt, unlocking the padlock, and locking himself inside, alone with the rotting corpse of a 22-year-old girl. He would sit for hours on the cold stone floor near her coffin. He sang his favorite German romances to her, read her poetry, and told her about how his day went. And at some point, his broken mind, desperately seeking reciprocation, began to feed him what he so deeply craved to hear: answers. It wasn't mysticism. It wasn't Elena's spirit wandering the cemetery. It was his own severe auditory hallucination that began to project a voice into the surrounding space. He heard how the creaking of the settling stone from temperature changes, the noise of the ocean wind in the mausoleum's ventilation slits, and the squeaking of rats transformed into her quiet, pleading whispers. His mind, poisoned by madness, refused to acknowledge the fact of irreversible biological death. To him, the process of decomposition wasn't a natural biological mechanism, but some sort of malignant disease that she had caught while already in the coffin, and which he, as a genius doctor, was simply obligated to cure. In his insane, detailed diaries, Tanzler would later write that Elena cried, that she complained about the unbearable cold and the grave's darkness, that she begged him to take her away from this horrible place, to save her from the relentlessly advancing decay, and to carry her somewhere warm. And the more her body decomposed, despite all his absurd attempts to use chemical preservatives, the louder and more demanding these voices in his head became, escalating from quiet requests to piercing, commanding screams, because his subconscious was in a panicked fear of the moment when nothing but bare, dead bones would be left of his perfect bride. By the spring of 1933, the situation had become critical. Tanzler was finally fired from the Naval Hospital for his frightening, erratic behavior and pathological obsession with the cemetery. He was left entirely alone, abandoned to his own demons, and his paranoia reached its absolute zenith. He firmly decided that if he didn't take Elena immediately, she would dissolve into the darkness forever. In one of the darkest, rainiest April nights, when the noise of the Florida downpour reliably drowned out any sounds and the streets were completely empty, Tanzler brought an inconspicuous child's toy wagon, which he had specifically bought in advance at the local market, to the cemetery gates. He entered the crypt, opened the coffin, and with his very own hands pulled out what had once been the beautiful Elena de Hoyos. The stench of decomposition inside the sealed stone box was so monstrous that any sane person would have vomited on the spot from a single breath. But Tanzler, blinded by his maniacal goal, didn't even pay attention to it. Before him lay no longer a girl, but frightening, decayed remains, ready to fall apart at any careless touch. With the utmost care, as if handling the most fragile crystal vase in the world, he wrapped these decaying remains in a clean blanket, loaded them onto his small wagon, and under the cover of night, constantly looking around like a hunted animal, rolled his terrifying burden through the rain-slicked, deserted streets of the sleeping city straight to his home. Every turn of his wagon's wheels on the wet cobblestones distanced him forever from reality. It was a moment of absolute, fatal no return. By stealing a lifeless corpse from consecrated ground, Carl Tanzler finally and irrevocably severed all existing ties with human society and plunged into the blackest abyss of such a primal, inconceivable psychosis that not even the most twisted authors of Gothic novels could have dreamt of. Now he had to live in the same bedroom with a dead body, and, in order to prevent this corpse from finally turning to dust right in his hands, the mad doctor had to apply all his medical knowledge and transform into the most terrifying, sickest sculptor in the history of mankind, one who needed not clay and plaster for his upcoming work, but piano wire, hot wax, formalin, and human bones. When the creaky child's wagon with the stolen body crossed the threshold of Carl Tanzler's isolated wooden house, reality finally ceased to exist for this man. Unfolding the soaked blanket in the dim light of a lamp, any normal person would have gone mad from primal horror, because after 2 years in a damp Florida crypt, the body of 22-year-old Elena was a rotting mass, where the flesh was already slipping off the darkened bones, exuding an unbearable toxic stench. But the doctor's psyche, afflicted by severe schizophrenia, operated through the prism of absolute denial. He saw not a stinking corpse, but his sick bride, in need of urgent treatment. Realizing that it was impossible to stop the decay, Tanzler began a frightening, methodical restoration, using his medical knowledge to create a grotesque illusion. To strengthen the crumbling skeleton, he masterfully bound the joints with stiff piano wire and metal coat hangers, creating a framework that could be posed and seated in a chair. He cold-bloodedly scraped off the rotted skin, replacing it with scraps of expensive silk, heavily soaked in hot wax and liquid plaster, sculpting a new, pale porcelain mask over her skull. Into the empty eye sockets, he inserted glass eyes, and this choice was not accidental. In life, the girl had looked at him with fear and disgust, but now these unblinking spheres stared eternally at their creator with that very mute adoration he so fanatically craved. Having cleaned out the internal organs that had turned to slime, he tightly stuffed the chest cavity and abdomen with old rags to restore volume to the figure, and on her head, he placed a wig made of her own real hair, which he had secretly collected during her illness. The main problem remained the heavy smell of decay, and Tanzler, like a pragmatic scientist, bought gallons of pure formalin and liters of the most expensive French perfumes, daily dousing his dead bride with this eye-burning cocktail. Thus began the 7 most terrifying years in history, during which Tanzler slept in the same bed with a wax doll assembled from human bones, regularly renewing the cracking wax and dressing her in luxurious wedding gowns, absolutely and sincerely believing that in this artificial world, entirely subject to him, he had finally become an almighty god who conquered the laws of nature for the sake of his twisted love. Any secret, even the darkest, most deeply hidden and carefully guarded one, possesses one unchangeable, destructive, and absolutely fatal property. It physically cannot remain forever in complete isolation, especially if this very secret is literally decomposing in an old wooden house on the outskirts of a small, stifling Florida town, where neighbors, driven by unbearable provincial boredom, are accustomed to maniacally watching other people's lives and noting the slightest deviations from the usual norm. By the fall of 1940, after an incredibly long, insane 7 years since the very moment Carl Tanzler stole the half-decomposed body of his beloved from the stone mausoleum under the cover of night rain, very bad, disturbing rumors began to rapidly thicken around his lonely dwelling, which was thoroughly soaked in aggressive surgical chemicals and acrid, cheap perfume. Rumors that local residents could simply no longer ignore, or condescendingly brush off as the ordinary senile eccentricity of a lonely weirdo. Tanzler, whose severe schizophrenia-stricken psyche over these 7 years had finally and irrevocably merged with his twisted, sick illusion of an ideal family, began gradually, day by day, to lose his basic instinct of self-preservation and elementary vigilance. He began to regularly and completely openly buy expensive women's dresses, silk stockings, bright cosmetics, and even expensive jewelry in local city haberdasheries, which naturally caused reasonable bewilderment among the sellers, since the whole town knew perfectly well that this man lived absolutely alone. When curious shopkeepers cautiously asked him who all these immodest outfits were for, he answered with a blissful, frighteningly sincere smile that they were gifts for his beautiful, beloved wife, and people just twisted a finger at their temples, considering him a harmless, deranged widower, spending his last cents on a ghost. But the fatal, irreversible mistake in his fabricated world occurred when one of the neighborhood boys, driven by unbridled teenage curiosity, sneaked up to the window of his house late one evening and peered into a narrow slit between the tightly drawn curtains, where in the dim, flickering light of a kerosene lamp, he saw something that forever traumatized his psyche. The old, withered Tanzler was slowly dancing to the hoarse sounds of a gramophone, tenderly embracing a giant, terrifying, life-sized doll whose face was hidden behind a pale wax mask and whose unblinking glass eyes stared dead into the darkness. Rumors of this devilish dance with a mannequin instantly flew through the streets of Key West and, like inevitable fate, reached Florinda, the biological sister of the deceased Elena de Hoyos, who from the very beginning had not trusted this German, remembering his suffocating obsession with her sister in life, and the fact that he flatly refused to give the relatives a key to the mausoleum. In October 1940, a furious and frightened Florinda forced her way into the doctor's house, and here we encounter an astounding phenomenon of his madness. He did not panic and lock the doors. He did not hide the body or throw himself at her with a knife, because in his sick reality, he sincerely believed that he had performed a genius medical miracle and proudly led her into the bedroom, expecting praise for saving the girl. Florinda took a step forward, subconsciously expecting to see a ridiculous scarecrow made of straw. But when her eyes adjusted to the gloom and her nose caught the sweetish smell of old organic decay breaking through the perfume, she froze in primal animal horror, seeing on the bed a bumpy figure made of hard yellowed wax, in the frozen features of which she recognized the face of her dead sister with a gut-wrenching scream. This scream shattered the silence. The police arrested Tanzler that same day, and Elena's remains were sent to the table of pathologists, whose examination shocked the most cynical doctors. The fragile bones were masterfully fastened with rusting piano wire. The empty chest cavity was tightly stuffed with dirty rags, and the decayed flesh was replaced with waxed silk and real hair sewn into the bare skull. It would seem that an electric chair or life in a psychiatric hospital awaited this obsessed madman. But here, the soulless, paradoxical bureaucratic machine of American justice intervened, which physically could not accuse him of murder, since hundreds of witnesses confirmed that Elena died of tuberculosis from natural causes, and the only real crime that could legally be imputed to him turned out to be the secret opening of a grave and the theft of a corpse. However, under the laws of the state of Florida at that time, the statute of limitations for this act was exactly 2 years, and since 7 long years had already passed since the night the body was stolen, the law proved completely powerless. The judge, publicly gnashing his teeth in disgust, was forced to officially clear Carl Tanzler of all charges and release this monster to freedom straight from the courtroom. This legal absurdity was accompanied by another, perhaps the most frightening and disgusting social phenomenon in this whole story. While the grief-crushed Cuban family, burning with shame and humiliation, tried secretly, under the cover of night, to rebury the mutilated remains of their daughter, transformed into a grotesque doll in a secret unmarked grave so that the mad German would not get to them again, a significant part of American society suddenly felt a twisted sympathy for the doctor. In the eyes of excitable housewives and lovers of cheap pulp novels, he appeared not as a terrifying psychopath, a mad genius, and a grave desecrator who slept embracing a decomposing corpse, but as a tragic mad romantic misunderstood by a cruel world, a kind of modern dark Romeo whose love turned out to be so boundless, deep, and all-consuming that it could step even over physical death itself. Tanzler walked free as a real celebrity. He gave paid interviews and repented of absolutely nothing, moving to another county where he still could not abandon his fatal obsession. Using a death mask that he had managed to take from the face of the wax Elena before the body was seized, this incorrigible old man created a new exact replica of his bride for himself, this time out of plastic, continuing to live under the same roof with her. He died in 1952 in complete solitude, and when the police opened his house, they found his lifeless body on the floor and his cold hands tightly gripping this terrifying plastic doll, the only surrogate of his unhealthy passion, the final and pathetic chord in the story of a man who was so panically afraid of losing love that he turned it into a nightmare, proving to the world that the most terrifying demons live not in hell, but in the selfish human mind, which justifies violence against nature with the word love. The folder is closed. The scariest thing is that this monster died a free man, never repenting of anything. Subscribe to Raccoon Archives. Here we pull from the darkness what others are afraid to even whisper about. Good night.